Okay, and let's follow that up with this question, because you've talked about this on previous episodes, that typically 3 years, maybe 4 years for a first-round quarterback, because it takes time to go into that role. And I've asked you this before, but now that the Jets are out of the playoffs, now that the Jets sit at number 13, if there's a quarterback there, and Zach Wilson feels like he may have taken his last snap. He didn't play down the stretch. He was the third quarterback, except when Mike White got injured towards the end there. Joe Flacco started the final game. You didn't even throw that bone to Zach Wilson. If you're the Jets at 13 and there's a quarterback that you like there, are you making that happen?
Okay, here's what I'm going to ask you. With how supportive and maybe overly supportive the Jets have been on Zach Wilson is going to be their guy of the future. It's only year two for him, so they think that he's still going to be the quarterback of the future, even though he hasn't shown any signs yet in these first 2 years that he's the guy. Is it a smokescreen knowing that they're saying that Zach's the guy, that other teams are going to think, well, they're not going to take quarterback because they're speaking so highly of Zach Wilson, that we'll just sit here and then see which one of these quarterbacks fall to us. So I don't think the top three will go down that far.
Right.
But they do have a very talented young roster. And I thought Joe Douglas did a heck of a job. They have potential of actually winning with Garrett Wilson, the offensive rookie of the year, and Sauce Gardner, the defensive rookie of the year.
Right.
So they have a very good defensive front. They got all the pieces in place. Breece Hall coming back. I know he's going to be coming back off an ACL, but you saw how good he was for that team. So the question is the quarterback the only missing piece? And when they're throwing out so much support for Zach Wilson, is that a smokescreen? And is a smokescreen season already started?
Right.
And is upon us.
And you would actually know better than me, because I'm sure you put out your fair share of smoke screens.
Never.
The thing with Zach Wilson, and maybe it is, that's right, maybe they're trying to distract us, and not necessarily that the Patriots did it a few years ago, but the Patriots just set pat. They didn't do anything. Mac Jones fell to them at 15, and they drafted him when there was all that conversation at the time that maybe Mac Jones goes third overall after the 49ers trade up, and they ended up taking Trey Lance there, who, it turns out, who knows what his future is now that Brock Purdy is playing pretty well on a stacked football team. But I think, here's what I'm thinking just on the outside looking in, Rick. If you're the Jets, and let's say you do decide to go with Zach Wilson, it feels like in that market with those pressures, if you start 0-3 and he throws 6 or 7 interceptions in 3 games, that's it. Like that's it. And then you've wasted the whole offseason to try to fix that problem. Because let me ask you this. Let's say you bring in a real veteran backup, not a Derek Carr, but someone who can compete for the job, like a Teddy Bridgewater type. That means Zach's looking over his shoulder, much more so than he probably was with Joe Flacco and Mike White. And then if he gets tight, struggles early, plays poorly, they're 0-3. I feel like that's could potentially cost people their jobs in terms of coaches. And then the quarterback situation is actually in worse shape than it was as we sit here right now in January.
Yeah, and that's the whole conversations that are going on right now. The number one thing you want to do right now is be upfront and honest with your coaches, with your personnel department. When you're heading into these meetings, probably maybe getting a week off to catch your breath a little bit, but the following week, you have to evaluate your roster and what is it going to take to get us over the hump. Now, my question is, with the Jets, is it the quarterback? Because everybody was buying Mike White jerseys until he came back to reality in the Seattle game, I believe. And then Joe Flacco, I mean, he's past his prime. So those are the things that you're discussing in your personnel meetings as you get ready to go forward. And if they do decide to go a different direction at quarterback because they have such a young, talented roster, what will they do? And that's the question that they're going to have to answer through this whole offseason process.
Man, part of me feels like you just say, all right, let's get Derek Carr and go from there. But there's a reason Derek Carr got benched. Maybe the reasons aren't all great. And I'm sort of.
But let me ask you this. Is it all on the quarterback there? Because Mike White didn't do very well. He had a flash, and he's always been a flash in a pan, but he's not the full-time answer. Like we talked about Flacco being beyond. Zach Wilson hasn't really developed when they lost a lot of. I know they had injuries up front on the offensive line. I don't know they lost Breece Hall, but are they looking at the potential? Is it a coordinator issue, or do they have the people on a coaching staff to make sure that they can develop either Zach Wilson or develop a young quarterback. And that comes into question a little bit because every team deals with injuries in the NFL, but the great coaches have a way, a la Kyle Shanahan. It's almost like no matter who they throw in a quarterback, and they've got a very talented roster and they got a championship defense. I understand that. But no matter who they throw in the quarterback, I mean, Brock Purdy was the Mr. Irrelevant last year, and no one even gave him a chance. But when you look at him, he's 6-0, 5-0 as a starter. And I was looking at some stats, and besides Justin Herbert, he's the only rookie quarterback that has thrown multiple touchdowns in 6 straight games. Herbert did 7. So all of a sudden, it's like, now to me, that tells you what type of coach Kyle Shanahan is, and how they develop quarterbacks out there. Now you got to go back and look internally. Not only as a quarterback, if he's just no good, he's just no good. You cut your losses and you move on. And I made some of those mistakes, and finally you just have to move on and live for another day. But you also have to analyze who is developing these young quarterbacks on your staff.
That's a great point. And it brings me back to a point that I've been thinking about a lot lately, is just how good Brian Dable has been for the Giants, because his track record was as developing young quarterbacks. We saw that at Alabama. We saw that with Josh Allen, and he went to New York with the Giants, and he actually gave up play calling duties, which is what he was known for. And you know this better than I do, Rick. Sometimes coordinators get promoted for what they did as coordinators, but they're not equipped to be head coaches because it's a different job. It's a different skill set. And I give Brian Dable a lot of credit for getting the most out of the players he's coached, both as a coordinator and obviously with the New York Giants. And the only other thing I would say, though, if you're sitting up watching the game in the suite as a general manager, and you see the young franchise quarterback get benched, and then you see the team lifted by someone like a day 3 Mike White or an undrafted free agent like Chris Streveler, what kind of impression does that leave on you when the team plays? It feels like they play harder for one player as opposed to the guy that you had hoped would carry this team.
Well, the thing with Zach Wilson to me is the maturity level and the leadership level, because what he did when he didn't take responsibility after he played horrid, I can't remember what game it was, and he said that it's not the offense's fault. All of a sudden that starts the finger pointing in the locker room. And then if you're pointing at us, why don't you look at yourself in the mirror? So Zach Wilson, I mean, I saw what there's no question that he's athletic enough, that he has enough arm talent. It's 2 things. To me, it's the leadership. It's his ability to read and recognize things quicker, because he really struggles, especially when teams pressure him and bring different blitz packages. You can't get away with the Rodeo Joe stuff that you did in college at BYU, running around and flipping the ball behind your back.
Right.
You can't get away with a pro day that everybody, and I was at that pro day, rolling to the ref to his left and throwing back to his right. And he had an unbelievable pro day. Sometimes it's not the physical ability, but it's the leadership qualities, and it's the mental ability as well.
All right, so we've talked about the Jets. Their coach is intact, and I think Robert Saleh's done a pretty good job, all things considered. You mentioned Joe Douglas and the job he's done.